Fear No Evil, Chapter 7. Subduing a single quirkless cultist was laughably easy for All Might and All for One. They didn't even need Aizawa, who they'd left dozing in his chair back at the hotel. It had seemed like a shame to wake him up when he'd had so much trouble sleeping on the plane. This was not an official mission, so they brought the prisoner to a warehouse owned by one of All for One's friends. Toshinori felt uncomfortable, but ever since he'd come to this country, he'd been operating off the grid. He'd thrown the law under the bus the first time that he'd arrested Humarise cultists back in Japan. It was a good thing he'd been planning to retire as soon as he trained young Midoriya. He did not fear legal consequences. The Hero Public Safety Commission would never let the #1 hero be publicly arrested. Their corruption and obsession with image generally disgusted him, but he knew it would work in his favor this time. However, if the commission got such potent dirt on him, he'd be forced to retire early if he wanted to avoid being their puppet. All for One would have cheerfully spread around the news if Toshinori didn't have the "you have a son" blackmail material in his back pocket. Toshinori didn't intend to ever use that since he couldn't drag an innocent child into their fight, but All for One didn't know that. The cultist looked like a normal middle-aged man with a goatee and a long face. As they waited for the unconscious man tied to the chair to wake up, Toshinori muttered, "How could a quirkless person agree to purchase a quirkless child like an object?" With whatever quirk must be enhancing his hearing, All for One overheard. "That man wasn't born quirkless. I took it. More as a favor to Humarise since he didn't have anything useful. He could change the color of his nails." "I should have guessed." Toshinori knew All for One had been working with Humarise against him for years. Of course he'd view the cultists and their prejudice as a free shopping mall full of quirks. The man groaned. Green eyes snapped open. "You're the abomination!" He struggled against his bonds as if frantic to get as far away from Toshinori as possible. All for One said, "You're in the same room as me, but more afraid of him? I'm hurt." The cultist's gaze flickered to All for One. He paled. "The #1 hero would never let you do anything to me. I demand a lawyer." His confidence was starting to come back. From bitter personal experience, Toshinori knew that Humarise had very good lawyers, and a network of bribed or believer judges. All for One smiled coldly. "All Might, would you mind stepping out of the room? It won't take long, not with the likes of this one." Toshinori flinched. This wasn't like before when he'd been able to reason with Botan. This cultist was one of their fanatics, who'd even given up his quirk. Several hundred quirkless children needed rescuing. Young Midoriya would die if his quirk was revealed. Toshinori turned and started to walk away. "Wait!" the cultist shrieked. "I'll talk! I'll tell you everything!" Toshinori stopped, very relieved he hadn't needed to find out if he'd been bluffing. Back in the hotel, Aizawa complained, "You should have woken me up." Toshinori said, "Honestly, even the two of us were overkill. The culprit folded easily." He spread the list of supplies being transmitted to Humarise across the table. Unfortunately, he didn't know the location where they keep the quirkless children. That's top secret even among high-ranking priests, much less this low-level errand boy. But we obtained information on their deliveries. Which of these supplies would only be used by children? All for One shook his head. "That won't work. Like all cults, Humarise encourages their members to reproduce and raise their offspring as more faithful servants. Children are everywhere. Toys will be in all the shipments. But look at this." He jabbed his finger at the list. "Child-sized float tanks." Toshinori's breath caught. For a moment he was back in the darkness, unable to move, unable to feel, unable to even die. Motion sickness rolled his stomach. Aizawa asked, "What are float tanks?" "They're a form of sensory deprivation. Some people find it calming and therapeutic to float in dark water for a few hours. They're used to treat anxiety, PTSD, or just for relaxation." All for One frowned. "Though I personally found them ineffective. I used one on my brother, but it didn't work. The doctors clearly told me it would make him calm, but he only seemed more agitated afterward." Humarise uses them for punishment, Toshinori said, his voice distant and very cold. Specifically, they use them on quirkless prisoners. They leave people in there for days, only opening the lid to feed them. It gets very bad when it lasts for days. It's a form of torture that leaves no mark so they can pretend to be unwilling to hurt their so-called chosen ones. Aizawa looked ill. Very gingerly and quickly, he patted Toshinori's hand. It was an awkward but well-intentioned gesture. All for One said, they wouldn't send the float tanks straight to the location of their base. They're too cautious. But at least now we know what city to visit next. He pointed at the name on the list. Izuku still felt extremely out of it. The world and Flecht's blue face blurred in and out. He shivered like a leaf in a storm. His throat felt like one big bruise. At first, his body had been numb, but as soon as he tried to move, the screaming sensation of pins and needles pierced him all over. Flecht had to lift his arms to get them into his robe. I can do that myself, Izuku croaked, struggling back to awareness. Shh, Flecht said. Finding this intensely patronizing, Izuku sluggishly attempted to throw off the hands. This meager resistance was all it took for Flecht to hold a sweet-smelling cloth over his mouth until he passed out. Izuku woke up in his old cell, his nose pressed against the splotch of flowered wallpaper peeking out from under the white paint. So this room had been converted into a sleeping place for him, and probably recently. He'd already known he wasn't being kept in the same place as the quirkless children, but it was an interesting confirmation. The water bottle on his end table looked tempting. His throat throbbed at the sight. Izuku tried to sit up. It wasn't easy. His arms wouldn't move. He felt the cotton sheets and a pillow under his head. Wriggling his body, he leaned against the wall and inched his way up. His nose itched, but he couldn't scratch it. He was wrapped in a straitjacket. This was going to make his plan more difficult. Izuku took a deep breath and told himself that he'd find a way. Sitting in this empty room wearing a straitjacket gave him plenty of time to think up ideas. This was probably part of his punishment, although Flecht would no doubt call it enlightenment. The gallon-sized water bottle had a straw sticking out. Izuku cynically suspected this meant he'd be stuck in the straitjacket for a while. He lowered his head and guzzled down the water as fast as he could. Pausing, he gasped in air, then returned straight to drinking more. It hurt his throat, either because he'd damaged it screaming or because he was drinking too fast. But he couldn't stop. He sucked at the straw until the last drops were gone. Someone opened the door without knocking. Flecht strode over and hugged Izuku. Izuku was starting to expect the hugs, if not get used to them. His stomach rumbled. Flecht smiled. I came to take you to dinner. The cult leader didn't have more important things to do? Izuku supposed this was convenient, if not welcome, since he had a few questions for Flecht. Flecht lifted him to his feet and put a hand on his shoulder. Izuku shook it off. I can walk on my own. You don't need to, Messiah. Flecht picked Izuku up and slung him over his shoulder. Izuku supposed this was his punishment for pushing away the hand. Botan's old warning came back to him. Don't reject physical touch. He was at a great angle to kick Flecht in the crotch. But he wanted to ask about Eddie and his son, and he wanted this straitjacket off, and kicking Flecht where he deserved it would be counterproductive to both goals. Plus, the cult leader's quirk would only reflect the damage. Flecht carried Izuku into a dining room and placed him at a table. A bowl of ramen sat in front of him. Although Izuku had hoped his arms would be freed to eat, instead Flecht blew on a spoonful, then held it out. Izuku said, I'll let you feed me if you tell me what happened to Eddie and his son. Flecht smiled as if Izuku were a pet who'd performed a cute trick. There's no point in trying to enlighten a sinner as irredeemable as that one. We simply confined Dr. Soul to his laboratory until his son arrives here. Dr. Soul is in charge of developing a gene therapy technique, using your genetic code, that will ensure the subject only has quirkless children. His incentive will be knowing that this will be tested on his son as soon as the boy arrives. To prevent him from coming up with a placebo, we'll kill the boy if it doesn't work. Izuku flinched. He didn't think what Flecht wanted was even scientifically possible, but he doubted even more if the cultists could be reasoned with. His plan had just developed a hard time limit. How will you know if it works? Flecht waved the spoon. Izuku took a bite, hoping to earn the next answer. Flecht said, "If the boy is still diseased, then it didn't work." Oh, no, there was definitely no possible way to remove someone's quirk with experimental gene therapy. They were going to kill Rhodey's soul. How long do you think it will take for Eddie's son to arrive? The children lost their mother at a young age. They're homeless and off the grid, so it's difficult to say. We have a bounty and searchers out. It could take a day or a week. It's most irritating. I view it as a holy trial. Izuku's eye twitched. I view it as a situation you caused when you abducted a kid's only parent and made him homeless. Yet somehow you've turned yourself into the victim here. He fake smiled. I've been very lonely here without someone my age. Can I meet Eddie's son? Flecht slowly nodded. Leaving him in your holy presence would make the experiment more likely to succeed. He fed Izuku another bite of ramen. As expected, their idiotic plan contains zero science. Out loud, Izuku only said, "Thank you." Flecht pulled out a jar of pills. These are vitamins. You'll need to take 2 a day. Given how long your poor, frail body has spent in the outside world, it's amazing you're not in worse health. Izuku eyed the pills. The jar claimed this was a regular multivitamin for children, but he didn't trust it. May I ask what's inside these, vitamins? They're harmless, store-bought vitamins. Here, I'll even take one if it reassures you. Flecht swallowed a pill, then drank from his water glass. Izuku, knowing he had no choice, let himself be fed a pill. Flecht said, "We supply all our chosen ones with regular vitamins and medical checkups, as well as keeping them away from the diseased outside world. The simple reality is that most are too fragile to survive without our loving care." This time, Izuku couldn't restrain his tongue. Do you think maybe if you keep quirkless people locked up away from the sun and often unable to use their limbs, that could make them weaker? We have sun lamps, Flecht explained. Way to completely miss the point. Izuku tried another tactic. This plan you have to release Trigger around the world will only make everything worse for the quirkless. Right now, people look down on us and discriminate against us, but they don't feel threatened by us. If your terrorist attack succeeds, then the quirkless population will be blamed, even though we're not the ones behind your plan. Just think about the poor, weak, innocent quirkless being massacred around the world by angry survivors. Picture the tragic scene in your mind. Flecht said, "That's why we've been trying so hard to place all the quirkless under our protection first. I know there will be losses, but if quirk singularity is reached, then humanity will go extinct." Izuku had heard that theory before, largely in tabloids. What kind of morons plotted a genocide because of an unproven theory? Even if quirks did become stronger over time, that didn't necessarily mean they would wipe out humanity. There were potential fixes that didn't involve mass murder. But he'd already established this cult had a non-existent grasp of science. He tried a more emotional appeal. You're plotting a genocide to prevent a genocide? That doesn't make sense. What makes you think quirk singularity will kill more people than your bombs? There's still so much we don't know about the development of quirks over time. Imagine if you threw in your resources with scientists working to help people with dangerous quirks. Then you could prevent the doomsday you fear. Flecht regarded him quizzically. Our goal is not to help sinners. Their deaths are a necessary part of the rebirth of the world. No, our role is the safeguard of the chosen few who will survive the coming apocalypse. Even crazier than he'd realized. Got it. If the quirkless are too weak to look after themselves, how do you expect them to survive after you kill everyone else? Flecht beamed. That's why the Humarise cultists will remain to continue protecting the chosen ones. It is a difficult sacrifice to stay in this sinful world, but I know that I'm necessary. Of course, the cultists didn't plan to kill themselves. They imagined ruling over a quirkless population, a placid, powerless bunch too weak to resist them. Izuku thought there was a good chance that if the quirkless became the majority, then they'd rise up and kill the monsters who'd massacred all their friends and family. Or, at least, he hoped so. That was what he'd do. Izuku gave up on using reason. At least now he could tell his conscience that he'd tried. He took another sip of ramen from Flecht's spoon. Then he pretended to choke. He grabbed the spoon with his teeth and threw it at the table. The hot broth splattered. Izuku watched as the drops approached Flecht, then bounced off him. The cult leader did not seem to notice. Flecht held up a cup of water. His brow wrinkled with concern. "You must eat more slowly," he said solicitously. Izuku pretended to cough before drinking. So even indirect damage could be reflected by the power. Furthermore, it did not require Flecht to be aware of the danger to activate. It truly was a strong ability. But Izuku had already taken that into account when coming up with his plan. Over the next few days, Izuku realized that his only purpose in this cult was to sit in a cell wearing a straitjacket while the top-ranking members stopped by to hug him. Apparently, no other quirkless were living at the scientific facility, so his purification services were in high demand. He'd been turned into their toy/therapy animal. Sidero, the iron ball-producing man who'd been involved in his first kidnapping, sobbed whenever he hugged Izuku, talking about how hard he found it not to use his quirk. Izuku tried a few times to tell him that it wasn't healthy to keep suppressing himself, but Sidero didn't listen. Izuku quickly realized that his role was not to talk. He was supposed to be a hugging dummy. Then Sidero left on a mission. The Serpenter's twins always came together. They talked over Izuku's head as if he wasn't present, gleefully discussing how easy it would be for them to rule the world after all the heroes with strong quirks were gone. They seemed less fanatical, but Izuku found them not a jot more open to persuasion because they were motivated by selfishness. Rogone, the man with an Oni quirk, always visited covered head to toe in cloth, gloved and veiled. Because he had a mutation, he wasn't allowed to touch Izuku's skin. Izuku honestly felt sorry for him to think that he'd probably lived his entire life being treated like a pariah. It was difficult to see how Rogone felt about this, since he wasn't allowed to talk to Izuku either. Being hugged by a giant through several layers of cloth was very awkward, but this whole situation was awkward. Sometimes they took him out of the cell to sit in a room of sun lamps with fake flowers painted on the wall. It was unbearably depressing. His arms had gone numb from too long restrained. He was worried that by the time he got loose, they would be too cramped to use. It was a huge relief to Izuku when Barros returned to the compound, because she'd actually ask before hugging him, and then not do it when he said no. By that point, Izuku was desperate for 5 minutes without being hugged, and for someone who would have a conversation with him as if he was a human being and not a pet. He talked to Barros about TV shows or books in an attempt to build a rapport that he could use later. It was relaxing. Almost normal. Izuku knew full well he had to move slowly and gently if he wanted to point out the flaws in the cult's logic to Barros. But he also knew that he had a time deadline. He had to set his final escape attempt into motion before Eddie's soul son became a human experiment. Sitting in a hard metal chair under the glare of a sun lamp, he asked Barros, "Were you assigned to the mission to look for Eddie Soul's son?" She folded her hands. "I'm not permitted to give that information, Messiah." She always sounded a little nervous whenever she turned him down. Sometimes, if he pressed a bit harder, he could get something out of her. "I wondered if you'd returned because you'd found him. But I haven't met him yet, even though Flechtturn promised me that I could." Barros sat up straighter. "The Supreme Leader would never lie to you. The boy needs to be purified before he can enter your presence." Ah, so she had brought back a captured Rhodey soul. Not good. He'd hoped for more time. Purified? What does that mean? Did you hurt him? No, we merely need to ensure that there's no foreign substances in his body. The food of the outside world is quite poisonous. I personally made sure he was fed during the purification, even though Sideros told me not to bother. Izuku winced. "Oh, I'm very glad you did that." Barros puffed out her chest and beamed. "Thank you, Messiah. Your kindness is an example to me." Izuku licked his lips and twitched inside the straitjacket. He'd need to make his move soon. "Barros, I don't think many people here care what happens to Rhodey. I worry about him. I have a lot of people here who want to look after me, but he has no one. I'd like to protect him. Will you help me? You're such a virtuous person, Messiah. Barrows sounded very impressed. Of course I'll help you, as long as it doesn't contradict the Supreme Leader's orders. That was at least a small concession, although the second part limited its usefulness. Izuku smiled in a strained way. Do you know why you were ordered to kidnap Rhodey? In other words, how do you justify experimenting on a kid? He holds some purpose in the glorious mission, Barrows shrugged. I often don't understand the wisdom of my elders, but we must trust that the Supreme Leader knows best. Izuku wanted to scream that there was no we, because he'd never joined this cult. Although technically Barrows hadn't joined so much as been raised up in their twisted beliefs. He took a deep breath before he said something undiplomatic. In a smaller voice, Barrows muttered, I have to obey. It's the only way to earn the right to see my mother again. Izuku perked up. Your mother isn't with Humarise any longer. Isn't that what you said? So if you wanted to see her, you could drop by Japan and look her up any time. He tried to sound casual and innocent, even though he wanted to scream, and I'd be more than happy to serve as your tour guide. Barrows burst into tears. She sobbed, My mother can't survive in the outside world. The sinful air will strike her dead. I've begged the Supreme Leader to let me bring her back, but the abominations people are watching her too closely. My current worth is not great enough to command the allocation of resources necessary to save her. Izuku jumped up, about to offer a comforting embrace before he forgot he couldn't move his arms. No, she definitely won't die. I promise. I lived in the outside world for years, and I'm fine. Barrows only cried harder. He'd pressed a tad too hard. Better to retreat before he lost what little progress he'd made. Izuku spent the rest of the session trying to calm Barrows down before the guards came to take him back to his cell. When the guards pushed Izuku into his room and closed the door, a teenage boy sat on the ground. At first, Izuku thought this was yet another cultist here to be purified by violating his personal space. But the boy wore handcuffs and had a black eye. Bruises dotted his arms. Izuku ventured a guess. Are you Eddie Soul's son? The boy grimaced. That's right. I'd shake your hand, but... He gestured with his cuffed hands at Izuku's straitjacket. My name is Rhodey. Rhodey Soul. End of Chapter 7. Omake Time. Omake, Izuku's hidden therapy quirk. Izuku. I don't get paid enough for this. Barrows. We don't pay you to be our messiah, Messiah. Izuku. See, how can I be a good psychiatrist if you don't pay me to deal with, points at the cult in general, all of this? Omake. Competition for Japan's worst cult. Redestro. There's only room for one evil cult in Japan. Flecked turn. I quite agree. I despise everything about you, from your diseased ideals to your dress sense. Redestro. I don't want to hear that from a bunch of people who only wear robes. Izuku. I award the prize of worst cult to Humarise because they currently have me in a straitjacket. Flecked turn. I'm so touched, Messiah. Izuku. It wasn't a compliment. Redestro. Hey! After he develops One for All, he could be our messiah too. Izuku. The author had better not be getting any sequel ideas from this conversation. Omake. Blatant hypocrisy. Izuku. So Humarise started out as a hate group against metahumans, then you just switched to oppressing different people as the demographics shifted? Flecked turn. That would have been the coward's choice. We merely kept on oppressing people with quirks while finding ways to twist our philosophy to also kidnap and abuse the quirkless. Omake. More hypocrisy. All for one. I'd never hurt my family. It's not torture if it doesn't leave marks. Flecked turn. I'd never hurt chosen ones. It's not torture if it doesn't leave marks. All for one. Allow me to amend my earlier statement. It's only okay when I do it because I'm the only one who understands where to draw the line. Flecked turn. There's also nothing wrong with hugging someone against their will, because hugs are good. All for one. You're calling me out, and I don't like it. Omake. During the dawn of the Age of Quirks. Hisashi. Float tanks are a legitimate therapeutical technique. My little brother has been acting quite hysterical lately with his demands for freedom and whatnot. This will make him relax. It will be like a spa day. It's not as though I'm hitting him or anything violent. He'll emerge completely undamaged, and perhaps a bit more obedient. I'm calm when people do what I tell them to do, and my little brother is not calm when he's disobeying me, so it stands to reason that we'll both be happier after he's a bit more under control. Self-control, my control, same difference. Hisashi checks his watch. It's been a few hours. Time to let him out. He opens up the tank. Yoichi. Can't move. Need you to help me. Just come a little closer. Hisashi. Look how frail he is, poor thing. He needs me to look after him. Yoichi grabs Hisashi's head and attempts to drown him in the tank. Hisashi. Ack! Why aren't you calm? This was supposed to make you calm.